to the European community, and he recognised the true intent of the project. This is particularly important in a left-wing city like this one, because it's commonly portrayed as a right-wing argument to be against the European Union. But the reality is it's not right or left, it's a question of freedom and autonomy against despotism. And it's important to remember that it was actually the Tories who took us into this. Another prominent left-winger who was opposed to the European Union is Tony Benn. He hasn't spoken out about it recently, but he was very clearly opposed to the European Union. If everybody could now turn to the next heading, the deceit of Edward Heath. You'll see there's a prime ministerial broadcast. I won't read it out in full, but he essentially said that we would not sacrifice any independence or sovereignty by joining the European Union. Now, we all know that turned out to be false, but what not everybody knows is that that was an outright lie. Ted Heath knew that that wasn't true. He'd met Monet in the early 60s, I think, or maybe it was actually in the 50s, and he was well aware of the true intentions of the project. Also, there's the Werner Committee, which was essentially a Foreign Office report. This explicitly said that the member states of the European Economic Community would ultimately end up with less power than the states that comprise the USA. He was aware of that, but he made no reference to it when he campaigned for our entry. Lies were also told about the common fisheries policy. Documents which have now been revealed show that the chief negotiator, Geoffrey Rippon QC, was told not to refer directly to the detail of the common fisheries policy, because lots of MPs whose constituents are fishermen started to recognise that this would have a devastating effect on their constituents' businesses. He was told just to tell these MPs that this was just being considered in the wider context. Okay, so these documents, which have now been revealed after the 30-year rule, show that the chief negotiator, Geoffrey Rippon, was deceptive and disingenuous. He wouldn't discuss the detail of the common fisheries policy because he knew full well that it could not be sold to the fishing industry. He simply said, this has to be considered in light of the full economic implications of joining. He also derisively described the fishermen as expendable. And that seems quite a cruel description if anybody's been to some of these old fishing towns. And the effect of us joining the common fisheries policy, incidentally, is fairly obvious. The UK's fishing fleet is at most half the size that it was when we joined in the 70s. And I think, I may be mistaken with this statistic, I think British fishermen catch about 11% of the fish in what should be our territorial waters. And I think our territorial waters are about 70% of all of the fishing resources within the European Union. So clearly the benefit's only one way there. There's also a direct lie by Geoffrey Rippon. He said that we would retain full jurisdiction of our coastal waters up to 12 miles, but that wasn't true. We would still be subject to regulation by the EEC right up to the beaches. Okay, now, if everybody could please turn to the next heading, which is the EC to the EU. Now, the transfer of power, quite obviously, has only ever been one way, but this deliberately has happened gradually. There's been an incremental approach. There's evidence that the treaty creating the European Union was deliberately divided up into two stages, one being the Single European Act, the next being the Treaty on the European Union. Incidentally, the vote which caused Parliament to accede to the Maastricht Treaty was one of the most heavily whipped votes in history, and there were some alleged irregularities, which I won't go into now, but you can see the reference there, the page reference in the book, The Great Deception. Okay, so I'll finish off by explaining what the current position is. Now, I'm not going to talk in generalities. I think I'll just give you some very specific examples of the power that the European Union now has. We have something now called the European Arrest Warrant. Now, that effectively ends the concept of extradition between us and the other EU member states. So previously, if you were going to be extradited, a British court would test that evidence. They wouldn't try the case, but they would make sure that the prosecution wasn't frivolous, that it wasn't politically motivated, there was no oppression involved. That's now ended. And you see, for example, with the Michael Shields case, the disparity between our justice system and the justice system of some of the other member states in the European Union. But if now, for example, Bulgaria were to put in an extradition request, as long as they completed the paperwork, we'd have no power to stop them. We'd have to hand over this citizen. It also ends a principle called dual criminality, which means essentially if we're going to extradite somebody, it has to be for something that would be a crime in this country. So say, for example, Iran wanted us to extradite somebody for wearing lipstick or for not covering their hair. We would say, no, I'm sorry, we find those laws unpalatable, we're not going to extradite them. Well, that can't happen anymore between us and the other member states. So, for example, Germany may want somebody extradited for Holocaust denial or other speech and thought crimes. The UK government, of course, claims that it's opted out of the criminal justice area. But, of course, the European arrest warrant is something relating to criminal justice. The reason for that apparent contradiction is that the government is being misleading. They haven't opted out of it. What they do is they opt in and out of specific measures within this criminal justice area without the need for parliamentary approval. So I advise people to always be sceptical of these claims that we've opted out. Remember the intentions of the European Union. The project can't work if member states pick and choose which areas they want to comply with and which directives they want to comply with. Asylum's another example where we supposedly have an opt-out, but of course we have actually acceded to some EU measures on asylum, and even if we hadn't acceded to any of them, if somebody's granted asylum in, say, Germany, they have free movement all over the EU zone, so they could come here and reside, and it would be a breach of community law to stop them. Another deceptive tactic politicians tend to employ is they won't reveal when they're implementing EU law. Does anybody remember the supposedly momentous decision Gordon Brown made to give the Bank of England independence?
Received a lot of credit for it as
well. Well, it wasn't his decision at all. It was actually required by Article 180 of the Maastricht Treaty. And although the Tories signed that, the deadline for complying with that expired about the time Gordon Brown made the decision to make the Bank of England independent. And that's just one example of where politicians claim they're making their own decisions when really they're just doing the bidding of the European Union. Another area where the EU is going to have more control is through the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, that was actually a creation of the Council of Europe, which isn't the same as the European Union, but now the ECHR is essentially part of EU law, so there's no real distinction between them anymore. If anybody's interested, I've got an article about that on the website, but this will impact on all sorts of areas of British life. The most recent example is the European Court of Human Rights has decided we must give prisoners the right to vote. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but really I would say it should be up to our Parliament. And I, for one, don't want to take any lectures in democracy from a dictatorship. It sounds rather absurd to me.